Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you would join us today as we continue to hear from a wide range of Aussie and global specialists and practitioners when it comes to multiplication and church planting. But before we jump into our episode today, we wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about our sponsor for this podcast, the Church Co. The Church Co is a website and app platform specifically designed for and with churches and church planters in mind. And the best part is that they actually build the website and app for you, so you don't have to spend exorbitant amounts of time, money, and energy learning a new tool. You might think that this would cost a whole bunch, but they are a ministry. And the price is similar to hosting a website at simply $29 a month. Also, the best part is that they are based here in Australia. So they understand the Aussie church and are building amazing tools with and for the Australian church in mind. So we want to strongly encourage you to check out the Church Co, as well as some promotional opportunities that we have with them. That's all from us for now, and we hope that you enjoyed this fortnight's episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Welcome today to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. Again, we're so glad that you join us. And today we are joined by Andrew Hurd. Andrew is the Senior Minister of EV Church on New South Wales' Central Coast, as well as being involved in a variety of other church planting initiatives and ministries. And I guess firstly, Andrew, it's just so great to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, I hope it's helpful.
Great. Well, Andrew, maybe just to get started, particularly maybe for our listeners who are hearing your name for the first time, maybe just give us a bit of context to who you are, some of the things that you spend your time doing, even tell us about your family, or maybe even how you came to know the saving love of Jesus. Would love to hear some of your coming to faith journey as well.
The who you are question is always a big question, isn't it? Who am I? Well, married with 4 kids, all married, all got kids of their own, which people are shocked at it because I look so young. But I've got quite the family. I grew up in a non-Christian home, was sort of a church sending home, but really converted in late teenage years. Sort of captivated by hearing the person of Jesus explained through Mark's gospel. I can remember it quite vividly I took myself off to kind of Bible talks to see if I could work all this out for myself finally, and was quite captured by the person of Jesus, who he is, who he claimed to be, just the extraordinary nature. So that changed everything. Became a Christian, very firmly convinced of life has been made by and for Jesus, made through him. And so at the very beginning of my Christian experience, I was very conscious that to live the Christian life in integrity was to live it for him, pursuing his purposes. And so very early on was very committed to the sense of we need to see many more people converted. So evangelism became quite a concern. I went through Bible college, worked in churches in Sydney for a while, and then about 1996 we moved up here, my wife and I, and started a new church here on the Central Coast. It used to be called Central Coast Evangelical Church, but no one could pronounce the name, so we shortened it to EV, the first 2 letters of evangelical. People were already calling us the EVs, and so it just made sense. And we've been at that for all these years. So, what is that, 96, 37 years or so. And it's been quite the journey. It's been, you can see I just look beaten and battered. So it's kind of church planting takes it out of you. I mean, ministry does, doesn't it? I mean, church life is just, it's got its challenges and joys. So that's a little bit about us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great segue, Andrew, into, of course, would love to hear in your capacity as the Senior Minister of EV, just some of that journey. I know we were speaking offline before just about this this great longing of yours, obviously, to want to focus upon God's goodness and God's faithfulness and what He has built through Church EV. And would love to just kind of hear more of how that came about. What was your conviction or your sense in which we planted that church in 1996? Why did you plant in the first place? Tell us some of the kind of, maybe some of the key points along the journey of the planting of EV Church and how God has been able to use it to reach many people on the Central Coast.
Yeah. Well, it's a long time, so it's a lot to talk about, really. We were very conscious that there are parts of Australia that a growing population, churches, as good as they might be, weren't growing. There weren't more churches being started. Central Coast of New South Wales, just north of Sydney, was a very high growing area. At one point, so 30 years ago, it was one of the highest growth areas in the state. And so we just realised that we could do ministry in a place where there were good Bible teaching churches, evangelistically minded, every 15 minutes. Or go somewhere where, despite the number of good churches, there was need for many more. And so, as is the case everywhere, of course. But so we were compelled to particularly reach a certain culture. We wanted to reach the beach culture, the coastal culture, which is the Central Coast. And so came here particularly with that concern to establish a ministry that might be effective in actually reaching people who would never otherwise set foot in church. And so that kind of flavoured and shaped the way we did things. We worked hard at contextualising church into our context. We started as a group of about a dozen in a lounge room, and it was kind of what we would now call a parachute plant. So we didn't have a core group. It was me ringing up people that I'd heard of and seeing if they wanted to join us in this venture. And the Lord brought a number of people together. We met for many years in school halls. We're about 13, 14 years in school halls with all the setup packed down. And, it was, you might have had this yourself, Charlie, but the people used to talk about the great ideal of not owning church property and how beautiful it is that someone else pays the bills and you just come in and out. But I tell you, the romance wore off very quickly. And the cost, it was very expensive to hire the school that we were in with all the kids ministry, youth group, midweek staff. It was just all very costly. The Lord gave some growth. We were seeing people converted regularly, people's lives being transformed and changed. We were there in school halls about 13, 14 years. And then about 15 years ago, I think that's the kind of time, we moved onto the site that we're now on, and we built a number of church facilities here. And so we've been here all those years, and the Lord continues to give growth. It's been quite the journey, lots of ups and downs. We've tried to plant churches through that time, so we've kind of intentionally sought to send off people to plant new churches. And just nurture a culture where that happens. So we've had a number of churches emerge out of our ministry just because of the enthusiasm of people to want to get up and get going. And so that's been exciting as well. We're trying to raise up young men and women to send them off into the mission field. And so that's been a great blessing to see the numbers of people who leave us to go off to Bible college, to get trained, to go further away. That's been something of the journey.
It's wonderful, Andrew, and we celebrate and thank the Lord for what He's done in and through that. And it's also been apparent, particularly even from distance for me, just observing a way that has inspired many other men and women to be on mission and wanting to plant churches. And I guess inspired by some of what the Lord has done through EV that has brought about the emergence, as to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, of the likes of FIEC and Geneva Push, which has now become Reach Australia, that is really a way of encouraging and bringing formation to those who might also go and plant churches. For those, maybe that's a new concept for them. Can you explain how those issues came about and how that's kind of encouraged others to do likewise?
Yeah. Look, it has been quite the journey. Not long into church planting, the first bunch of years you've got your head down, just trying to survive, just trying to get this fledgling thing moving forward. But after a few years, if the Lord gives the growth, you can lift your head up a little bit and look around. And one of the things we felt back then, and a number of us did, it wasn't just me, but there was a number of planters at that time who felt that there was more to be done if we could do it together. And so we formed a bunch of years ago now a new denomination called the Fellowship of Evangelical Churches, FIEC. Started with about half a dozen churches from a couple of different states. And we've been working all these years to kind of build the health of that, lay the foundations of that the Lord might use that in the generations to come to be a vehicle of ongoing church planting and to be a home for faithful gospel ministry. So we now have, I think, about 60 churches across the country in FIEC, and it's growing each year. So that's been a really wonderful journey. The conferences for that each year are a real highlight. It's a band of men and women in pastoral ministry together who get together, and there's just this energy of kind of first generation pioneering work that's quite exciting and stimulating. So that's been wonderful. So we've been part of that from the beginning. And then a few years after that, me with a few others again, were conscious that Australia was growing population, the churches weren't growing in number, and we felt that we needed to do what we could to be part of encouraging church planting across the country. So we formed together a thing called Geneva Push, which, as you said, has now become Reach Australia. And Geneva Push started with the aim of being the means by which we could gather together people and stir them to think about church planting, be part of church planting, and help each other in the planting. So we didn't think of ourselves as a kind of an organisation to run it, but rather as a place to get together and bring the planters who were learning all kinds of lessons through positive and negative lessons. Do you know how that is? You learn the things you shouldn't do, the things that are helpful to do. We wanted to create a place where that network of planters who were already doing the work and learning the lessons could get together with others who were thinking about doing it and provide a context and a network, a fellowship where we could ensure perhaps the lessons didn't get repeated in the next the mistakes didn't get repeated in the next generation. And so that was Geneva Push, and through that work, it's been quite wonderful. I think in the last 14 years, we've seen 140 churches planted. So about 10 churches a year have been planted across a number of denominations. So that's been hugely encouraging. And some few years after that started, we realised that the future of church planting actually depends very heavily on the health of established churches. Because typically, if we're going to multiply the church planting movement like we need it to multiply, church plants can't provide the planters enough. So we need established churches to raise up planters, which therefore means you need healthy established churches that are going to cultivate a vision and an outward-looking momentum so that young men and women who are growing up in youth ministries and into their young adult work get captured with this vision of reaching the country for Christ. And so we realised if we're going to keep the movement of church planting going, we needed to pay attention to established churches and their health. And so we morphed Geneva Push into a thing we now call Reach Australia, which is effectively the two parallel works of planting and growing. Correct. So, revitalising, strengthening, helping established churches be healthy and facilitating church planting together. And so Reach has now been going for some few years, and we're seeing great fruit from that. It's been a great encouragement. Lots more to do.
Absolutely. I think you make some really acute observations there, Andrew. And I think the thing that stands out for me, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, I'm sure you've heard the analogy of flywheel, like to get something going is very difficult, like to build that sense of creating a culture, a send culture. Have you found that, particularly as you've developed that network approach of, affiliated churches with one another, that's easier, or has that remained as challenging, and particularly in the cultural moment that we're in as well?
Yeah, the flywheel illustration I think is a good one. I think there is a momentum that's gained, but the challenge with flywheel is, in our world, the inertia towards slowing down is much greater than you might expect in a big flywheel. And so you can get movement going, but it needs it needs to be fed, it needs to be fueled constantly. It's that old saying, isn't it, that vision leaks? And it's just the reality that when we're confronted with sin, the world, and the devil, we've got a lot of headwinds.
Yes.
And so to maintain the momentum of a flywheel that begins to get going, it takes lots of constant prayerful input. And so, I think there's a truth to the illustration, but there is to the metaphor, but there is a challenge to it. The other one is the challenge with the flywheel too is to keep it on track. So it is possible to get momentum and constantly need to fuel it and feed it. But the challenge then is to make sure it keeps on the direction where it needs to go. And so, it requires constant vigilance, care, paying attention to all the ins and outs and bits and pieces. And that doesn't just happen. I think we all hope that, if we just preach and pray and God raises up this thing, it'll all just keep happening. But the history of the Christian church has shown repeatedly that there are good beginnings that always slide or fade, and it takes a lot of energy and effort to keep things going. Yeah.
Very true, Andrew. And I think that, again, is a wonderful connector to what I'd love to kind of hear your take on. You have been known as a Bible teacher. You communicate the gospel regularly and often, and that's as part of, I guess, the centrality of what it means to be a church leader and a church planter. I'm interested to hear from you as a senior minister, but also one who is passionate about church planting. I guess your scriptural mandate or conviction, your heart as to why you continue to plant churches, have this heart for those who don't know Jesus. It may seem like a bit of a simplistic question, but I'd just love to hear from you. What are the gospel drivers that continue to keep this front and center for you?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number of clear biblical statements that are always, for me, a driver. But then there's a theological frame and shape that drives me. The clear biblical statements are, Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations. But then you've got those beautiful expressions, say in 1 Timothy 2 and 2 Peter 3, where God expressly states his desire to see all people saved. Ezekiel 18, this kind of thing, where God doesn't delight in the death of anyone, he longs to that all be saved. And the 2 Peter 3 one's always, for me, very compelling in the sense that 2 Peter 3, it's that passage that talks about God's patience. He's patient with you. Why hasn't he returned yet? It's the life's going on and on and on, and how come the end hasn't come like he promised? And Peter says, don't be a fool. Don't be a fool. That 1,000 years a day. The Lord is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish. And I take it what Peter is saying, and this is really quite compelling for me. Well, I think what Peter's saying is that the only reason we have one more day on earth is because the Lord is patient and wants more to be saved. So we are not here. He has not given us one more day so that we can improve our careers or travel or enjoy. He's given us one more day because he's patient with us, not wanting anyone to perish. And so to be captured with that vision that what he cares about is the salvation of the lost, and he's giving us time to achieve that, ought to cultivate in us a desire to pursue the same end. So that always is quite compelling. The big theological things that do drive me with that as well, though, are I talk about 5 things. God's vision to have everything united in Christ. God's great purpose, the reason he made all things was that all people might be brought together in Jesus. And so every human on the planet's meaning is found in coming to know Jesus. That's God's purpose. Heaven and hell, the fact that we're here for a short time, there'll be a day of judgment, and it'll be a serious and dreadful day. And the consequence of that will either be heaven or hell. And that must motivate us to pursue our friends, family, workmates, neighbours. The fact that Jesus went to the cross when he could have done so many good things, he went to the cross to seek and save the lost, which tells you what matters most to God. The shortness of life, the brevity of life, we're only here for a few short years. Let's make the most of it. And I then offer the last one being love. If you have a heart that loves people, how can you bear to not do everything within you to seek and save them? So that whole package of things for mine means every day I get up slapping myself around the face, saying, get back at things again. There's lots of other fun things you could do in life, but get back at this task.
Yes.
Be about the things that God is about. Have his heart for the world. And so get up, preach the gospel again. Seek to stir one another to faith, to good works, to love. So that's the kind of thing that drives me. Yeah.
No, that's great, Andrew. And I'm sure, as you mentioned before, bearing some of the scars of pastoral ministry and church planting, it beats us up, and yet there is profound impact that is being had in our respective communities for men and women who continue to do that. And I guess our final question I'd just love to ask you today, Andrew, is particularly related to as a leader who has had skin in the game within the Australian church for several decades, particularly when it comes to creating cultures of church planting. You talked about to create that sending culture. That's a thing that EV have been able to curate and do often. I guess, what would be your sense of parting wisdom to our listeners today, particularly as we keep some of those theological frameworks front and centre? But I guess even just some parting advice that you may offer to church planters, church leaders, denominational leaders who might be listening today about more than ever, the need to plant churches that reach people in Australia.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we need to work hard at is clarity. So in the midst of all the challenges and all the demands on your time, it's easy to get fragmented. It's easy to be drawn after many different agendas and priorities and concerns because there's so many things, so many good things to be done. And I think we do need to keep before us the great clarity of Matthew 28, make disciples of all nations, 2 Peter 3, 1 Timothy 2, these kinds of passages, the reality of heaven and hell, that we never lose sight of, in amongst many good things, that the central and most important thing is to be about seeking and saving the lost. And with that in mind, the statistic that I find quite confronting is that by 2030, we expect Australia to be 30 million people. And given the current number of churches per head of population, so 24, 25 million number of churches closing, so on and so forth, to keep just the current proportion of church per head of population by 2030, we need to plant 3,000 more churches.
Wow.
And that's just to keep, that's not growth, that's just to keep the same number of churches per head of population, 3,000 more churches. Or commit to growing those churches that continue to be open 2 or 3 times bigger.
Wow.
Now, I what I'm hearing around the Christian community is lots of people don't like big church. Well, okay, but let's commit to reaching our country, which means we not only need 3,000 more churches, we need 6,000 more churches by 2030. Wow. there's a great deal at stake and there's a lot to do.
Yes. Andrew, that again is a spur on encouragement to our listeners today, particularly around those who might be thinking about church planting or churches that may yet do take a step in sending a church plant. And so I just want to thank you for your time today, a great source of encouragement. Thank you for the way that you've very humbly shared the way that you work in and through EV and the many churches that continue to plant it. And we really appreciate the time that you've taken, Jerry.
Good on you. Thanks, Jim.